It's my great pleasure on behalf of all of us to welcome Teshin Sweger tonight. Teshin is well known here at Mountain Cloud. He's offered several Dharma talks in the past year, I believe, and has been also instrumental in helping to organize some wonderful collaboration that's developing between the North Carolina Zen Center, where Teshin is a resident teacher and priest, Florida Sambo Zen, and Mountain Cloud Zen Center. Just a little bit about Teshin's background. He, I believe it was 2017, he moved to the North Carolina Zen Center and as a resident there, together with his wife, Dana, and now their daughter, Araya. They live there and have a robust Sangha there. Maybe some of them are with us tonight. Teshin also has trained in psychology, done graduate work, postgraduate work, and works as a licensed professional counselor, officing there at the Zen Center. So able to really bring together this long training in Zen with his training in psychology and his own resonance with the intersection of those practices. Say a word about, he began practicing in 1993. This is kind of lovely detail because of the influx of St. John's students who have been coming to our first two intro classes. Teshin was in college and an English professor there taught him Zazen. That English professor happened to be a student of Philip Kapleau. And eventually Teshin began going and spending his summers at the Rochester Zen Center. And he became a student when he finally moved there with Lawson Sachter, who was one of Philip Kapleau's Dharma heirs, completing the RZC koan curriculum there with Lawson, and eventually going, I think it was 2002, with a small group of students from Rochester to North Carolina to establish a Zen center in Asheville. And so the story unfolds. A few years ago, Teshin reached out to Henry, and then to me, and it's been really a great joy to meet every few weeks when we can and take up this amazing terrain, this landscape, this inheritance of the koans, sharing the Dharma in that way. So Teshin, thank you again and welcome. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you. How is the sound? Is that coming through?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, and thank you, Valerie, for the wonderful introduction and the invitation again back to share with your Sangha. There are just a few here in the Zendo. I sufficiently scared off most, sending out an email saying I would be talking about the same thing I talked about on Sunday. So if folks didn't want to show up, that would be fine. Of course, then thinking about that, talking with Valerie last Sunday in Doksan, and it's really not possible to talk about the same thing twice, right? It's always fresh, alive, and so I want to talk about tonight this important commemoration in the Buddhist tradition, the Parinirvana of the Parinirvana of the Buddha. Before I start with it, I'm just curious how many people that have their cameras on would consider themselves Buddhist in some way. I'm just going to kind of scroll through as people put their hands up if they do. Okay. A few, yeah, here and there. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's always interesting to see, I think Buddhism, as I shared with our Sangha here, Buddhism is one of these words that was, I think, invented by the English when they came to India and encountered the Dharma. They found statues of the Buddha and relics and said it's got to be an ism, right? So it's going to become Buddhism. But in India, it was called the Dharma, the Buddha Dharma. So yeah, this commemoration of the Buddha's death, his Parinirvana, as it's called, is, as far as I can tell, most commemorated in February. So February 15th is the traditional, at least in Japan, maybe some other Buddhist countries, the traditional time that it's commemorated. So I think we're on today's the 16th. So right around that time. And so for people that don't know, Parinirvana refers to this, as I said, the death of the Buddha, pari or para, this word in, I think it's Sanskrit, it could be Pali, that means to gone beyond. Gone beyond. We chant that in our prajna paramita, gate, gate, para gate, parasam gate, gone beyond, gone completely beyond. So pari. And then nirvana, of course, nirvana means extinction, like a flame or a candle being blown out. And really, this refers to, in Buddhist terms, this flame refers to these poisons, this greed, hatred or ill will, and ignorance or delusion. And so this Parinirvana commemoration is one of the 3 times that we really bring the historical Buddha to the forefront and commemorate his life. The other 2, of course, being his birth, which is usually celebrated in the spring. Here was 70 degrees today. Daffodils are up, middle of February, so it feels like spring. So in spring, we celebrate the Buddha's birth, and then the Rohatsu in December, the great awakening or enlightenment of the Buddha. So these 3 major commemorations of the Buddha. And so when we talk about the Parinirvana, we're talking about death, really. And it's one of these topics, of course, that we want to avoid in our culture. We have terms like passed away, or they succumb to their illness, or, so many of the ways we avoid even using the word death in this death-phobic culture. In listening to a talk on the Parinirvana from another teacher from a few years ago, she mentioned this very well-known article that many of you may have come across. It's from the Onion newspaper, and I won't read it, but just to give the title, the title is "Death Rate Holding Steady at 100%." So in our small town here, 5,000 people or so, this small town of Pittsboro, North Carolina, we have a death fair every year. For the last at least, I think, 7 years or so, there's a fair that's centered on death, bringing it right to the forefront, workshops on green burials and how to celebrate, how to bring in ceremony, and all kinds of speakers and workshops. And so it's quite a beautiful thing to be a part of. So the Buddha was 80 years old when he died. He taught for 45 years. 45 years, spending his life wandering from place to place, teaching, practicing. And I don't know how many of you have spent time reading the Pali Canon, the early teachings, the sutras, but there's such a human flavor to the Buddha. You get to see, of course, there are the miracles and all kinds of things as well, but you really get a sense of the person, that in many ways he walks from place to place. He deals with conflict among different factions. He deals with conflict within his own sangha. A number of weeks ago, I shared one of the passages from a Pali Sutra where he wasn't able to solve a conflict within the sangha. They refused to take his advice. So we see this very human side of the Buddha. And so his Parinirvana is sometimes called the great unbinding. In ancient India, an unbinding meant unbinding from the four elements of earth, wind, fire, and water. These fundamental forces that make up a person, hold the body and mind together as it was thought. And there's a koan in the Gateless Gate, the Muman Kan, that asks us about our own unbinding. These are the three questions set up by Master Tosutsu. And the last of these three barriers goes like this. He says, if you have freed yourself from life and death, you know where you will go. When the four elements separate, where are you off to? Where are you off to? And so there are so many of the koans that deal with birth and death. And really, this is to my mind, the central question of our life. The question to be resolved, our own deaths. In a commentary on this 47th case of the Muman Kan that I read not too long ago, a teacher relayed that the Roman Emperor Claudius used to look into the eyes of execution victims to see if he could see what has happened, what happened at the moment of death. Perhaps trying to see beyond the barrier. And also have read that in more modern times that there have been doctors this is maybe back in the turn of the 20th century or maybe even before that, trying to weigh the soul. They would weigh the body before death and then weighing the body right after death, and to see if they could see how much a soul weighs as it escapes the body. Of course, all these attempts to understand death. And from a Zen point of view, this is our question, and yet it can't be resolved with our intellects, with thinking about it. by conducting experiments. Maybe through the experiment of Zazen. That's our wish, to understand it, to really know it. And there's a part of us that, as one of my teachers used to say, longs to have reassurances whispered to us around death. And yet reassurances won't do it either. In another of the koans that we take up, we meet Master Dogo and his student Zengen. And it goes like this. Dogo and Zengen came to a house to express condolences. One of the Sangha had died, and Zengen, the student, tapped on the coffin and said, "Is this life or is this death?" Dogo said, "I won't say life, I won't say death." Zengen said, "Why won't you say?" Dogo said, "I won't say, I won't say." On the way back from their condolence call, Zengen again asked, "Master, please tell me right away. Tell me. If you don't, I'll hit you." Dogo said, "You can hit me if you'd like, but I won't say." Thereupon, Zengen hit his teacher. And then the koan goes on. Some time had passed and Dogo had died, and Zengen went to another teacher, Sekiso, and asked. He first told Sekiso what had happened between him and Dogo, and asked. Sekiso said, "I won't say life, I won't say death." And Zengen said, "Why won't you say?" Sekiso said, "I won't say, I won't say." And with these words, Zengen had an insight. Is this life or is this death? Why won't he say? Is it simply that it could be that he simply wants his student to find out for himself? Is this life or death? Our teachers are always pointing us back to our own capacity, our own abilities, not feeding us with answers, beliefs, whispering reassurances, although sometimes we do need reassurance. So you could see it that way, but I think there's something more fundamental to our own true nature that Dogo is showing and Sekiso is showing their student, Zengen. Zengen had an insight. You could say in that moment, Zengen became unbound, the great unbinding that happens. And I think it's important for all of us, if we're going to see through birth and death, we have to look into what it means to be unbound. We can think of unbinding as sort of no longer being tied up to something. One of the images for Nirvana, as I mentioned earlier, is this candle flame going out. And in ancient India, it was thought that fire and its fuel were bound together, that fire was sort of trapped by its fuel. And as long as it was bound to its fuel, it would keep burning. And so it was thought that it should be freed from the fuel. And we could ask ourselves, what do we need to become free from? Unbound from? Of course, we always talk in Zen about our opinions and ideas, those strongly held beliefs that keep us bound or clinging, even to our bodies as they age, as they change, how difficult it is to let go, to accept. In thinking about this term, unbinding, I thought to how many times I would work doing carpentry. I used to be a carpenter for many years, and before I was a therapist, and how many times I would pull at an extension cord or a nail gun hose, and how often it would be bound up, wrapped up, knotted up, getting tangled. And I would struggle, especially as a young carpenter, struggle to pull those bound up cords through doorways and just get frustrated, over and over again, tripping over cords and trying to manage them. And anybody who has, I think all of us can relate. Even our little extension cords or earphone cords at home, how often they get tangled. And it took me such a long time to really take the time to slow down, to wind them up carefully at the end of the day, to not just struggle through it, to unbind, as I was thinking about that process, I decided to see what other people would say about this, these cords, because I thought there's got to be a reason. It seems like you wind up an extension cord and put it in the drawer, and somehow it just finds itself tangling itself up into knots. And I thought there's got to be a reason for this. And as I went online, sure enough, there was a scientific paper called Spontaneous Knotting of an Agitated String. And I thought that would be a wonderful title for a Dharma talk. A spontaneous knotting of an agitated string. It was a study that was done by a scientist at the University of San Diego physics department. And it turns out that knots even occur when you coil a cord up very carefully and put them away. It all has to do apparently with the relationship between the length of the cord and the amount of agitation it experiences. And so there's apparently some sort of statistical pattern that can be plotted on a curve. How much of our lives feel like a knotted up extension cord, right? Twisted and looping in and out. As I was working, we're installing a bathroom here down at the dormitory building. And as I was working on that, noticing one of these knotted up cords that I didn't put away so carefully, I was struck at just the beauty of how incredible it was to see how something can become so tangled. Each knot representing, in a way, a kind of movement, a kind of life, agitation. This, like our lives, how so many of us carry all of the knots that we've encountered in our life, we carry those in our bodies as well as in our minds. Years ago, when I was moved to Asheville, I went to see a body worker who does Rolfing, this kind of myofascial release therapy. And he was recommended. He was a very large guy, and so he was very strong. And anybody that has had Rolfing done knows that it's not your typical massage therapy. It can be actually quite painful, digging deep into the fascia, into the below the muscles. And he would have me come in before the office opened because my screams were a little too intense as he was working on me. He didn't want any of the other patients hearing that kind of pain. And yet the process was just what I needed. As I was laying there one time, he was working on my neck, and he came across a pocket of a sort of knotted up area, and he just began to press and press and press. And finally, this releasing happened. And suddenly it was just like this wave of tears just came over me. It felt like something deep had just been let go of. And the tears wouldn't stop. It was just such a wonderful experience. And as I was being iced afterwards in a different room, just overwhelmed with this sense of gratitude for not only his work, but just this body, this human life. How it can hold so many of the traumas. It can hold. It is holding everything, not just our own personal history, but the history of all of humanity coming down right into this body. And so this practice is really about this unbinding process, a process that can be challenging, difficult, but also very freeing and joyous. And as we practice, this is what we're doing. We are, through our attention, through our care, we're spending time learning, understanding all the ways that we bind ourselves constantly. We're spending time getting to know the landscape of our own minds, what used to be so unconscious, perhaps. It reminded me of when I was a kid and a friend of mine was into the Rubik's Cube that had just come into being, and he got so good at it, he could just hold it up and look at it and turn it, not even move any of the pieces, just look at it for a few seconds here or there. And then within a flash, he just went, and it was totally solved, the Rubik's Cube. To spend time looking, to examining this body-mind to see what needs to be done, what's blocking us, all of our habit patterns, the ways our minds have been conditioned, those patterns that are so often egocentric, meaning so hard to see, so bound up with who we take ourselves to be, right? That it's like, no, this isn't a habit. This is just who I am. It can feel that way, of course. And so this process is really a process of getting some healthy distance from those patterns, seeing them for what they are. They are not us. And so we can think of this process of slowly and carefully unwinding our knots. And from a Zen point of view, the ultimate knot is this knot of self, of me, of I, which of course is a no self. There's a well-known Theravadan monk, Thanissaro Bhikshu, and he said this. He said, samsara, which is of course this world of suffering or dissatisfaction, as the Buddha talked about, samsara, he said, is a process of creating places, even whole worlds. This is called becoming, and then wandering through them. This is called birth. Nirvana is the end of that process. You know, the end of creating places, the identities, the solidity that we inhabit. This is the process of relinquishing it and seeing that there is no there, you know? This is the process of nirvana. It's not a place. It's not a place you arrive to. It's a process. Through this work, we really come to see how somehow that we're not really bound at all in that way. There is nothing solid to be bound to. That we've never been bound. There's an old saying in Zen from Japan, binding yourself without a rope. We can really come to believe in our own brokenness, our own stuckness, our own knots or limitations, all those obstructions. We can really come to believe in their solidity, struggling to find our way through. But that itself can become a prison of trying to find your way out. That can become the obstacle. Zen master Basui, a Japanese Zen teacher, said this. He asked, what is the master within you who at this very moment is seeing and hearing? If you reply, as most do, that it is mind or nature or Buddha or one's face before one's birth or original nature or the known or the unknown or truth or delusion, or you say something or remain silent, you fall into error at once. What is more, if you are so full-heartedly as to doubt the reality of this master, you bind yourself, though you use no rope. However much you try to know it through logical reasoning, or to name or call it, you are doomed to failure. Find out in an instant who it is. So here, Basui emphasizes that our unbinding happens now, in an instant. Again, Master Basui said at a different time, what do you lack? Simply faith in yourself. That's all we lack. Because when we lack faith in ourselves, then of course we enact that lack of faith in our life. And thinking about this knot stuff, unbinding, of course, the very famous story of the Gordian knot comes to mind. This legendary story of Alexander the Great, who took up the challenge of a king. I don't remember the names. Maybe Henry, if he was here, he's so versed in these old stories. But this king apparently created this puzzle, this knot that was so tough to work with that he challenged anybody that can undo this knot will get this prize or whatever, And Alexander the Great comes right up and takes out his sword, and with one cut, cuts right through it. In another version of the story, he just he does it a little more gently without a sword cut. But to cut right through is what we can do. And this cutting right through, it reminds me to come back to the Buddha, very much of this Lotus Sutra, which is not in the Pali Canon. It's part of the Mahayana tradition, where the Buddha, he gathers the community together and sort of drops this bombshell on the community. He says, all that I have taught you has been an illusion. He called it skillful means. He said, everything I have taught you has been simply my attempt to keep you on the path. He said, there is nothing to extinguish. There's no suffering to transcend. There's no nirvana to achieve. In fact, he said, not just what he taught, but his whole life journey was skillful means. He, in fact, was never born as a prince. He never left the palace, for people who know the story of the Buddha. He never practiced those austerities. He never sat down under the Bodhi tree, and he never reached full enlightenment. He said, there is only one body, the body of the Buddha. He said, this world is not a place to escape from, but it's one field. He said this, although my pure land never decays or dies, the sentients see it as ravaged by fire and torn with anxiety and distress. To the deluded and to the unenlightened, I say that I have entered nirvana, although in fact, I am really here. This is what I think of in modern terms as the Buddha's mic drop, like done. Cut through in an instant. Cut through. To cut through, we have to come back to what is essential in our life, to what's most important. And we have to do that again and again. What the Buddha taught was to come back to the awareness of our own inevitable death. Right? Like, how are we going to live if we had 1 year left? If we had 1 month left, or 1 week, or 1 day, 1 hour, what would we do? This is a way to cut through. It's not about the bucket list or traveling here and there, or, that might be a part of it for sure, but that's not it. It's about turning to this life. When we're aware of the fleeting nature of this life, the impermanent nature. It motivates us. It motivates us in our practice. It calls us to live. It also shows us how we hold back in our life. And then we can ask, why would I want to do that? Why would I do that to myself? What am I waiting for? I'm only here for a short time. I need to understand this life, to be curious about it. This momentary expression that walks and talks and thinks, and so this curiosity, this wondering, it's very different from being paralyzed by fear, this fear of death that so many people have. And so bringing it right to front and center, as Master Dawi said, he said, to take this question of birth and death and put it on the tip of our nose. It's so easy to become distracted by so many of our things in our busy lives that we get caught up in. As the Buddha called these, the 8 worldly concerns or the 8 worldly winds, how we pursue pleasure and try to avoid pain, and how we, I'm trying to remember these here written down, how we try to, shore up our significance and avoid insignificance. We try to go towards praise and recognition and avoid blame and condemnation. But at some point, if we keep that awareness of our own mortality on the tip of our nose, we begin to see through these things. We see how unsatisfactory this constant back and forth is. And instead, we turn to something greater. What becomes most important are not the conditions of our life, It's not about the conditions where we find ourselves. It's really about using whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, using them to do the work, to care for others, to clear our own minds. And so coming back to this, which can, by the way, be done in any circumstance. This is what Zen teaches us. We don't need anything special to do this practice. And so this word nirvana, this extinguishing, removing the fuel source, this is why we practice. There's this wish to extinguish the fires within us, those habit patterns, as I've talked about, but also to see how if we don't do that, they're passed from generation to generation. And so it's really about freeing who comes next in our world, gives us reason to practice other than just for this one body. Taking away that fuel source so that the flame can't pass from one to the next, which of course gives rise to all the fires of the world, the fires of greed, which give rise to consumption and possessiveness, the fire of ill will or hatred, which gives rise to war and conflict, possessiveness, how avoidance gives rise to isolationism, kicking the can down the road for the next generation, putting off what needs to be done. Now, one of the things that I come back to in my own practice is the Buddha, when he had his great enlightenment, he said, what could be done is now done, right? No putting off. So I thought I would end this evening, this talk, by just reading a part of the Parinirvana Sutra. Just a little bit here to share some of the Pali Canon. It says this: in his old age, the Buddha had recovered from a serious illness. He came out of his dwelling place and sat down in the shade. Ananda approached, saying, "Fortunate it is for us, or for me, O Lord, to see the Blessed One recovered. When I saw the Blessed One's sickness, it was as though my own body had become as weak as a creeper. Everything around became dim to me, and my senses failed me. Yet I still had some little comfort in the thought that the Blessed One would not come to his final passing away until he had given some lasting instructions respecting the community." The Buddha answered him, saying, "What more does the community expect from me, Ananda? I've already set forth the complete Dharma, the teaching, without making any of it hidden. I have no such idea that it is I who should lead the community, or the community depend on me. What final instructions would I have to give? Now I'm frail, Ananda. Old, aged, far gone in years. This is my 80th year, and my life is spent. Even as an old cart, Ananda, is held together with such difficulty, so the body of the Buddha is kept going only with supports. Therefore, be islands unto yourself, refuges unto yourself, seeking no external refuge, with the Dharma as your island, the Dharma as your refuge, seeking no other refuge." Then, knowing the time of his death was approaching, the Buddha went to the sal grove near Kushinara with a large community of monks. He said to Ananda, "Please prepare a bed for me between the two twin sal trees." Then Ananda, going into a nearby building, stood leaning against the door jamb, weeping. "Here I am, still in training, with work to do, and the death of my teacher is about to occur." The teacher who had such sympathy for me. The Buddha became aware of Ananda's grieving and asked him to come to his side. He said, "Enough, Ananda. Don't grieve. Don't lament. Haven't I already taught you the state of growing free from attachment to all things dear and appealing? What else is there to expect? It's impossible that one could forbid anything born, existent, fabricated, and subject to disintegration from disintegrating." Then the Buddha said to the community, "Now, if it occurs to any of you the teaching has lost its authority, we are without a teacher, do not view it that way. Whatever teaching and guidelines for conduct I have pointed out and formulated for you, that will be your teacher. Now then, community of practitioners, I exhort you, all fabrications are subject to decay. Bring about completion by being heedful." Those were the Buddha's last words. The Buddha entered a series of meditation states, and upon emerging from them, he immediately was totally unbound from this earthly existence and passed away. At that moment, when the Buddha was totally unbound, there was a great quake, awesome and hair-raising, and the drums of heavenly beings sounded. And so as we commemorate the Buddha's death, out of respect, out of admiration, of course, for his teachings, we can come together like this to practice. But really, this practice, this commemoration, you could say, is about putting, as Dawi said, this impermanence right there on the tip of our nose. So thank you for listening tonight.